Today you go to grad school. This is not a 101 lesson. Does a good leader of an organization understand when it is important to have a revolution or an evolution? You bet. Hello again, everyone. I'm Eli's dad with Project Eli, where we educate, we lead, we inspire. And once again, this is not something that is, a 101 course. This is something for leaders to understand, but you can listen to it also because it's got some good points to it. First of all, we talked about revolution versus evolution on the personal side of the balance sheet as somebody starting out, as someone looking to become a 5%er. All right, well now, let's say you are the leader of an organization. And the same phrase, revolution or evolution, still pops into the forefront. Let's take a look. The definition is a little bit different than on the personal side of the balance sheet. So let's take a look at the definition as far as a business is concerned. The term evolution in business is used to describe prolonged periods of growth where no major upheaval occurs in organizational practices. The term revolution is used to describe those periods of substantial turmoil in organizational life. This was a lesson that I had to learn kind of two ways. The first way that I learned it was I'm running an office in San Diego. I've been successful with it for a couple of years already. I've developed a couple of people that have promoted from just like I was answering an ad and promoted them into management. And now I'm working with a leader, a lady that I liked, I respected, and she's having difficult time. Okay, this was a commission position, and in a commission position, it's like playing basketball, Eli. Sometimes you go up, sometimes you go down. You have good days and bad days. She was running into kind of a stressful period of a slump. And she was unhappy about producing, and I think I'm going to quit, and I'm trying to talk her into sticking around. She's a person I've put in a lot of time developing to get her to that level. I mean, she was the number 2 person in my office, and she's out in the field, she's running the field for me, and she's not happy. And so when my mentor Bob Anderson calls me on the phone, and as he always started off a phone call, well, Eli's dad, what's happening good? All right, so I always had something good ready because I knew that question was coming. And then he said, what else can I help you with? Well, I'm having a difficult situation with Mary. He said, what's going on with Mary? So I went over and I explained to him. He said, I have the solution for you. I'm thinking to myself, oh boy. I said, okay, what's the solution, Bob? He says, get rid of her. I'm thinking to myself, come on, I've invested so much time in this woman. Isn't there something we can salvage? He said, have you tried to salvage? Have you worked with her on salvage? Before it comes to me, I know you spent time working on it. What you told me, the things that you did, they didn't work. It's time to cut the cord. It's time to get rid of her. I said, what? He said, she's going to poison the rest of your people. She's going to poison them. You're building a culture there. You've got to get rid of her. Let her go. Well, I struggled for a while. Of course, I know everything, as I do now. And she stuck around for a while. And then I saw that Bob was right. And when last time she came in to tell me, oh, I'm unhappy, I said, you know what? I think it's time. So I want to wish you the best. I'll write you a really good recommendation, but I agree with you, it's time. And I got rid of her. And there was some work to do. It wasn't just putting on a Band-Aid. There were stitches that needed to be applied to the organization, my office. But I learned from that. There comes a point from an attitudinal perspective where, you want to have people, there's a difference between somebody that disagrees with your policy versus someone that's unhappy and is spreading that unhappiness throughout, your organization. All right, it's okay to have someone disagree with you, and they do it in private. And then whenever, as a group, when you have your leaders meeting, a decision is made. that's the decision. You make that clear to everybody. You say, when you're the leader, you're going to need that. I need that from you. All right. Once, you can disagree with me in private. You can try and sell me on why your point of view is correct. But once the decision's made, that's the decision. We stick with it. We're all unified in that decision. That's the way leadership operates. Am I clear on that? Crystal. All right. That's a key point. But it's okay to, and you want to have people like that, because that gets you thinking that, these are the people that are on the front lines. You want to have that. But when it's an attitudinal thing, you can only take so much. You can only, cure the cold for as long. But then when it gets real serious, you got to go to the hospital, and then you got to cut off the machine. And I learned that lesson the hard way. Should have listened to Bob in the first place, but I learned that lesson the hard way. And now I want to tell you a different story about the company that I work for with Bob, called Copa. I was, this is a few years later, I'm managing offices, in the Midwest, Detroit and Indianapolis and so on. And my offices are doing very, very well. And then all of a sudden, my office is starting to go, they're going downhill. And Bob's looking at the numbers and he's saying, Eli's dad, what's happening out there? What's happening to your offices? You were doing so well. What's going on? All right, you got to get your butt out in the field and see what's going on. And after some significant urging on his part, I went out in the field, and I found that doing what we had to do to talk to customers was, the prospecting part was becoming increasingly difficult. And I couldn't put my finger on why. And I went out in the field, and I never had trouble prospecting. I always was able to knock on a door, get into a house, just from sheer numbers and tenacity and effort and a little charm, I might add. But I was able to get into the house and write business on a consistent basis. And I taught this to my people, and everybody has their own individual style. But everybody's numbers were going down, so I had to go out and see, and I went out with people, and then finally I just went out by myself, and I was having the worst time getting in. Now, the other offices, this company had like 30 offices or so around the country. The other offices were still doing pretty well. It was essentially my two offices in the Midwest that were having difficulty, and I couldn't put my finger on why, and neither could Bob. And Bob was sold on the system because it was his system, and the system worked for many, many, many years. It worked like a charm. I used it in California, I used it in Florida, I used it in Cincinnati, I used it all over the country. I used it, and it worked. It was terrific. Why was it failing me now? I didn't know. I wasn't smart enough to know. I was still, relatively speaking to my present age, still a puppy. I was in my 30s, and it was struggling for me. And finally I came to the point where you have to have some integrity, as a leader. And I said, what, if I can't get in the door, how can I ask somebody to do what I'm not doing and do so with a straight face and be sincere? I'm promising them growth. I'm promising they're going to learn. I'm promising they're going to make money. And yet now, where I was able to do that, I was one of the top producers in the company. Now all of a sudden I'm having trouble doing it. I couldn't understand, and I ended up parting ways. Well, needless to say, it took a lot of reflection on my part, and I didn't come up with the answer until a few years later. And the answer was, right around that time, there was some turmoil around the country with people there was an expression which probably still prevalent today, people going postal, where some disgruntled postal workers and in different locations went into their offices, and there was some gunplay, and it was not nice, and it was headlines. Today it might not even be on page 10, all right, but it was headlines back then, and it started to put fear into people, and the expression going postal became, a popular expression, and everybody knew what it meant. And people in the Midwest tend to be more conservative than people that live, let's say, in California or Texas or on the West Coast. And people that are conservative were not, when knock on the door, they were not letting people in the door. I didn't realize the wine because at that time, but now I do. And then I found out subsequently that some of the other not some of the other offices, all of the other offices ended up with the same affliction that my offices did in Detroit and Indianapolis. And I can't help but thinking that Bob stuck too long with that system. The system was starting to go down, the numbers were decreasing. He had one of his top producers in a situation in two separate offices in very similar locations that were not doing what they were doing. He had me hop in the car to see what was going on. He had me go out in the field by myself to see what was going on. He should have come in on a plane and gone out with me together so that he could see what was going on. And he would have said to himself, you know what? The system needs adjusting. And what happened was, ultimately, all of the 30 offices or so ended up closing because they all suffered the same fate that my offices did, numbers going down significantly, and if you can't pay the bills, you can't stay open, and that's essentially what happened. The point is, as the leader of a business, you've got to keep your eyes on the data. You've got to seize the data all the time. You've got to see what's happening. And when you start to see either a spurt or a decline, you've got to say, why? Why did that happen? What's going on there? I need to get to the bottom of that, either for the good or for the bad. And my mentor, my number one guy, the guy that I worship to this day, did not do that. Nobody's perfect. And that ended, unfortunately for me, our relationship. And I'm very sorry for that, but he's a man that I always care for and love and respect, that took me from nothing and helped me to become a divisional vice president with that very same company. He was my mentor. I lived in his house with Bob and his wife for a couple of months. And I mean, he did so much for me, and there's so much respect there. But the point is, if you don't want to have a revolution where you have to drastically change things, and keep in mind how difficult that is for one person to make the decision to drastically change their life, to drastically change their outlook, to drastically change their vision, to change the things that they're doing. And think of how difficult it is for one person, imagine what it is when you're trying to get a whole group of people to do that simultaneously. Very difficult. Very, very difficult to do. Nearly impossible. So the answer is, you've got to keep your eye on the ball, you've got to keep your eye on the data, and you've got to make evolutionary moves, minute changes on a regular basis. If you ask someone to change a little bit, are they going to whine and complain? Yeah, okay, we live in a nation of whiners and complainers, but if you keep it within a reasonable prism, then you're in a position where you can get that job done. It's a policy decision. Here's the why and because we're doing it. This is why we're doing it. These are the results we expect. We're going to monitor the results very carefully. We're going to give you feedback all the way along. These are the steps that you take when you're making evolutionary changes. When you're making revolutionary changes, you're going to find people that are going to say, that's not what I signed up for, that's not my job description. There's a line that you cross. And when you do that, then you have the bad attitude. And when you have the bad attitude, it's a cancer. It spreads faster than COVID-19, much faster. And you lose people very, very quickly. So as a leader, don't get comfortable with your system. Use your system. Have it be fundamental. But recognize that sometimes outside changes evolve, like what happened in this case with going postal and people becoming very distrustful of letting people that they didn't know into their home, that sometimes outside circumstances change your system and it needs to be tweaked. That was the case with the company known as Copa that I worked with. And even the greatest of the greats can fall into the trap and fall in love with their system and say, it works, it works, it works. You've got to keep your eye on the ball, and you've got to get into the field to see what's going on for yourself. That's how the best leaders operate. All right, revolution versus evolution. And let's always remember, hey, don't ration that passion, fashion the passion. I'm Eli's dad.